When power falls into the wrong hands, it takes courage, not control, to set things right. The HOA thought they could steal a soldier's land, but they forgot one thing. You can't evict a man who's already fought for his home once before. When Sergeant Daniel Hines returned from his 14-month deployment overseas, all he wanted was silence. Not the kind filled with awkward conversation or city noise, but the kind that came with home. The wind through the trees, the sound of gravel under his boots, the creak of the old wooden porch his father built 30 years ago. That porch was more than just wood and nails. It was his father's legacy, a place where they'd shared stories, laughter, and countless cups of coffee before he'd passed away. But as Daniel turned down the dirt road that led to his family farmhouse, something felt off. The trees were still there, the fields still stretched wide and golden under the evening sun, but there was a strange metallic glint ahead, something that didn't belong. His truck slowed to a stop as his heart sank. Where his father's weathered gate once stood, there was now a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. A bright red sign screamed from the entrance, "HOA restricted area, private property, trespassers will be prosecuted." Daniel frowned, stepping out of his truck. The air was still, but heavy, the kind of heavy that told you something was deeply wrong. He walked toward the fence, boots crunching against the gravel, his reflection wavering in the metal dot beyond it. His farmhouse stood aged but strong. The paint had peeled more than before, and the shutters hung a little loose, but it was still his home. Yet now it looked distant, like a memory someone had fenced off from reality. "Excuse me," a sharp voice barked from behind. Daniel turned. Striding toward him was a woman in a pale pink blazer, hair perfectly curled, a clipboard clutched like a weapon of authority. She looked like the kind of person who smiled in public meetings but crushed people with paperwork behind closed doors. "You can't be here," she snapped, her heels digging into the gravel. "This is a restricted zone." Daniel blinked, confused. "Restricted? Ma'am, I live here. This is my property," she scoffed. "Not anymore. This land now belongs to Maple Creek Estates, under the jurisdiction of the Homeowners Association. Any unauthorized entry will be reported." He stared at her, stunned. "Maple Creek Estates? That's the neighborhood 2 miles east. This isn't even in your development." "Wasn't?" she corrected, flipping a page on her clipboard. "As of last spring, we annexed the surrounding parcels for community expansion. Your lot fell within our new boundaries." Daniel stepped closer to the fence, gripping the cold metal. "You can't just annex private property. My family's owned this land for generations. I have the deed in my truck." The woman smiled, not kindly, but with the smug confidence of someone who believed the law bent to her will. "Oh, I'm sure you do. But unfortunately, your unpaid HOA fees and the property's neglected condition resulted in legal acquisition by the association. Everything was handled properly through county channels." He took a slow breath, trying to steady his temper. "Unpaid fees? I've never been part of an HOA. You can't charge me for something I didn't agree to." "Whether or not you agreed is irrelevant," she replied coolly. "All homeowners within Maple Creek boundaries are automatically subject to HOA regulations. You were mailed multiple notices. Since you failed to respond, we proceeded accordingly." Daniel's mind spun. Notices he'd been overseas, stationed in a desert halfway across the world. His mail had been redirected to a base P.O. box. Nobody from home had mentioned anything unusual, not that anyone was left to. His parents were gone, and his only brother lived in another state. "So while I was out there," he pointed toward the horizon, his voice tightening, "serving this country, you people decided to steal my home because of some paperwork trick." The woman's expression hardened. "Watch your tone, Sergeant. I understand you're used to authority, but this isn't the military. Around here, we have rules, and you broke them." He let out a bitter laugh, more disbelief than humor. "Rules? You built a fence around a man's life and called it rules." She didn't flinch. "The community deserves order. We can't have rundown properties lowering home values. Frankly, you should be thanking us. Maple Creek is one of the most desirable developments in the county now. Once construction is complete, this area will thrive." Daniel's jaw clenched. He stared at her, this woman who saw his family's land not as history or sacrifice, but as potential profit. "You have no idea what this place means. My father built that house with his hands. He worked this soil every day until he couldn't anymore. You think you can replace that with townhomes and call it progress?" The woman raised her chin, unshaken. "Sentimental attachment doesn't override community standards. You'll need to vacate the premises immediately. If you refuse, we'll involve law enforcement." She turned sharply, already walking away as if the conversation were over. Daniel stood frozen, the wind tugging at his jacket, the echo of her heels fading into the distance. His home, his land, had been stolen through a maze of fine print, while he was serving the very country that allowed it. He looked back at the farmhouse one last time. The porch swing his mother loved was gone. The flagpole in the yard stood bare. Everything felt wrong, sterile, corporate, and cold. For a moment, he felt powerless. But then, something in him shifted. The soldier in him, the one who'd faced worse than this, began to stir. He didn't know how yet, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let the HOA win. Her name was Karen Blake, and in Maple Creek, that name carried weight. the kind that made homeowners tense up the moment they saw her silver SUV pull into the cul-de-sac. She was the self-appointed president of the Maple Creek Homeowners Association, though no one remembered ever voting for her. Her grip on the neighborhood was absolute. She called it leadership. Everyone else called it a reign of terror. Karen had earned her reputation through what she called beautification campaigns. To outsiders, they sounded noble, a woman trying to keep her neighborhood clean, orderly, and valuable. But to the residents who lived under her rule, they were nothing short of tyranny. She once fined an elderly couple $500 for painting their shutters, a shade of blue that clashed with community harmony. Another time, she ordered a family to demolish their backyard shed because it didn't match the HOA's approved aesthetic. And perhaps her most infamous move, she'd reported a disabled veteran to the county for having a medical ramp she deemed unsightly. That ramp was his only way out of the house. Now, it seemed, Daniel Hines had become her latest target. Karen had noticed his property the moment the HOA boundaries expanded. She saw the peeling paint, the overgrown grass, the faded barn, and she saw opportunity. To her, it wasn't a family homestead. It was a blemish on her perfect community map. Her HOA empire needed more land, and Daniel's farmhouse sat right where her vision board had placed the future Maple Creek Phase 2, a luxury townhouse extension with a private park and walking trail. When Daniel first confronted her at the fence, she'd felt a surge of satisfaction. The soldier had that look, calm, polite, but firm, the kind of man who thought fairness still existed, that made it all the more enjoyable for her to crush that belief. When he tried to reason with her, to speak to her like a neighbor, Karen sneered. "You soldiers think you're above the rules," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "But around here, I'm the law." The way she said it made Daniel's stomach tighten. Her tone wasn't that of someone enforcing guidelines, it was of someone who enjoyed power. He stared at her, jaw tightening, the sunlight catching the edge of his military dog tags as they glinted against his chest. "You have no authority over private farmland," he said, trying to stay calm, though every word tasted like restraint. Karen smirked, holding up a folder thick with papers. "Oh, I do now," she said proudly, waving them like a victory flag. "You weren't here to object, so we moved forward. The county approved the annexation months ago, all perfectly legal." "Annexation," Daniel repeated, disbelief in his voice. "You can't annex land that's not for sale." She gave a short, cruel laugh. "Oh, Sergeant, you'd be surprised what can happen when people don't pay attention. You were gone for, what, a year? Maybe more. Things change. Communities grow. We made sure everything was done by the book." He took a slow breath, his mind spinning. He'd heard of shady HOAs, but this was robbery dressed in legal paperwork. "You mean to tell me you took my family's land without permission while I was deployed overseas serving this country?" Karen crossed her arms and tilted her head, feigning sympathy. "It's unfortunate, truly. But the HOA sent multiple notices regarding unpaid dues, property maintenance violations, and unregistered structures. You ignored them all. We had no choice but to act in the community's best interest." Daniel took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I was overseas, fighting for the freedom that allows you to even run your little meetings." Her eyes narrowed. "And I thank you for your service," she said, in a tone that clearly meant the opposite. "But service doesn't exempt anyone from responsibility. Around here, everyone follows the rules, soldier or not." He could feel the heat rising in his chest. It wasn't just anger, it was betrayal. His country had always been his home. Now, home itself was turning against him. "You can't do this," he said quietly, but his voice carried a dangerous edge. "You can't just decide what's yours and what isn't." Karen leaned in slightly, her perfume sharp and artificial, her eyes glinting with the thrill of control. "Watch me," she whispered. Daniel's fists tightened, but he didn't move. Years of discipline kept him from reacting. Instead, he studied her, this woman who hid behind bylaws, who believed her clipboard gave her power. To her, his life's work was just a technicality, a line on a spreadsheet to be repurposed. When she finally walked away, Daniel stood there, motionless, staring at the land that was no longer legally his. His father's barn, the one where they'd fixed tractors and stored hay, had a red tag hanging from the door now. It read, "Demolition scheduled." He picked it up, the paper fluttering in his hand like a flag of surrender. But Daniel Hines didn't surrender. He'd seen villages crumble under corruption overseas, and he'd helped rebuild them. He knew what injustice looked like, and he knew how to fight it, not with rage, but with resolve. As he watched Karen's pink blazer fade into the distance, he knew she saw herself as untouchable. She had her lawyers, her committees, her fancy neighborhood friends, but what she didn't realize, what she could never understand, was that Daniel wasn't just another homeowner. He was a soldier who had fought wars bigger than her. Paperwork empire. And if she thought she could bury his legacy under HOA bylaws and county seals, she had just declared a war she wasn't ready for. Because Daniel Hines wasn't just going to get his land back, he was going to make sure Karen Blake's empire fell with it. Over the next week, Daniel Hines made it his mission to fight back through every legal and ethical channel he could find. He wasn't a man of chaos. He believed in process, in the system he had sworn to protect. but now that same system seemed designed to work against him. He spent days driving between law offices and government buildings, stacks of documents in hand, old deeds, tax records, photos of his property stretching back to his grandfather's time. Each meeting ended the same way: sympathetic nods, polite apologies, and one phrase he'd grown to hate, technically valid. The county officials told him the HOA's annexation fell into a gray zone. Because he hadn't been physically present to dispute it, it was processed uncontested. His military service, his absence, his sacrifice, none of that mattered to the bureaucracy. Paperwork didn't care about patriotism. One attorney, a kind older man named Jenkins, summed it up painfully. "Sergeant, I've seen this before," he said, tapping the folder with a sigh. "The HOA's got a web of legal loopholes and friends in the zoning department. You're right, they stole it. But proving it, that's going to take time. Maybe years." Years. Daniel echoed, disbelief tightening his throat. Jenkins nodded. "And that's assuming the HOA doesn't sell the land before then. Once development starts, it's 10 times harder to reverse ownership." That night, Daniel drove back to the property, headlights cutting through the mist that had settled over Maple Creek. His stomach churned when he saw, the flashing hazard lights ahead, heavy machinery parked at the edge of his land, the ground already torn open. The barn, his father's old hand-built barn, was half collapsed. Bulldozers sat nearby, engines idling like mechanical beasts waiting to finish the job. And there she was, Karen Blake, standing tall in her pink blazer and heels that sunk slightly into the dirt, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand. She was barking orders at the construction crew, clipboard tucked under her arm like a general commanding troops. "Make sure the tree line comes down by tomorrow," she said sharply. "That old oak has no place in the new layout. It'll ruin the sight lines for Phase 2. Daniel stepped out of his truck, fists clenching. "That oak tree has stood there longer than any of your fancy townhomes ever will," he said, his voice low but trembling with anger. Karen turned, smiling that same smug smile. "Ah, Sergeant Hines," she said mockingly. "You're trespassing again. I suggest you leave before I call security." "You're destroying my family's history," he said, stepping closer. "You can't just do this." "Oh, but I can," she replied sweetly. "And I am. Look around you. This is progress. New homes, new community, new value. You should be proud. Your land is being put to better use." Her words hit him like a punch. He wanted to yell, to shout at the injustice of it all, but instead, he just stood there, breathing hard. The sound of metal crushing wood echoed through the night as a bulldozer's blade tore into the last standing wall of his barn. Karen didn't even flinch. By the time the crew packed up for the evening, the property looked like a war zone. Trenches dug deep into the earth, piles of debris scattered where memories once stood. His father's tools, the ones passed down through generations, were buried under mounds of soil. The oak tree, the one his mother used to sit under every morning with her tea, was now marked with a bright fluorescent tag that read "Remove." Daniel sat in his pickup truck long after the last light had gone out, staring through the windshield at the ruins of everything he loved. The night was silent except for the faint hum of distant machinery. His reflection in the glass looked hollow, tired eyes, clenched jaw, and a storm brewing behind the calm. He had fought enemies in deserts, mountains, and cities torn by war. But this felt worse because this wasn't a battle fought with guns or bombs. It was one fought with paper, signatures, and greed. He opened the glove compartment and pulled out a folded photo. It was of him and his father, standing by that same barn years ago, both covered in sawdust, smiling proudly beside a for sale sign they never used. His father had once told him, "Land is more than dirt, son. It's your story written on the earth. You protect it, or you lose who you are." And now, that story was being erased one bulldozer at a time. Daniel felt a heaviness in his chest that words couldn't ease. He'd done everything right, followed the rules, gone through channels, trusted the law. But maybe, he thought, some battles weren't meant to be fought in courtrooms. Maybe some battles needed a different kind of strength. He took a deep breath, pulled out his phone, and scrolled through his contacts. His thumb hovered over a number he hadn't called since returning home. His commanding officer, Colonel Raymond Carter. He hesitated for a second, then pressed call. The line clicked, and a firm but familiar voice answered. "Hines. You okay, son?" Daniel stared at the wreckage of his land and said quietly, "Sir, I need help. Not for me, for what's right." There was silence on the other end, the kind that carried weight. Then the colonel spoke, his tone measured but resolute. "Understood, Sergeant. I'll see what I can do." When Daniel hung up, he didn't feel relief. Not yet. But for the first time in days, he felt a spark of something he'd nearly lost. Hope. He started his engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness once more. The war wasn't over. It had just changed forms. And this time, Daniel wasn't fighting for a flag or a mission. He was fighting for home. The morning air in Maple Creek was split by the deep rumble of diesel engines and the rhythmic thud of heavy boots. Neighbors peeked through blinds, startled awake by the sight of olive-green military trucks crawling down their quiet cul-de-sac. The convoy stopped right at the edge of what had once been Daniel Hines' farmhouse, now a torn-up construction zone marked with the Maple Creek HOAS banners. Dust billowed as the first truck door opened, and out stepped Sergeant Daniel Hines, his uniform crisp, his face unreadable. He wasn't here as a broken homeowner anymore. He was here as a soldier reclaiming what was rightfully his. Karen Blake burst from the HOA office moments later, hair disheveled, clutching her phone and clipboard like weapons. "What on earth is going on here?" she screamed, her voice echoing across the half-built lot. Her heels clicked furiously on the gravel as she stormed toward the men in uniform, her expression twisted with disbelief. "You can't just barge onto private HOA property. I'll have you all arrested." Daniel didn't flinch. He stood firm beside a convoy of military engineers and 2 federal legal officers. One of them, a composed woman in a dark uniform, stepped forward, her presence instantly commanding silence. "Ma'am," she said firmly, raising a folder of documents stamped with a federal seal. "This property is under federal review and temporary reclamation. It's been identified as land historically deeded to a veterans' trust from 1954. All unauthorized construction and occupancy must cease immediately." The words hung in the air like thunder. Workers paused mid-hammer. The sound of machinery sputtered to a halt. Karen's face turned a shade of red that matched the HOA sign hanging crookedly from the fence. "That's absurd," she snapped, her voice cracking. "This is private property. It's part of Maple Creek Estates. You can't just—" The officer cut her off sharply. "Ma'am, interfering with a federal land review is a criminal offense under Title 18. If you or your board attempt to obstruct this process, you could face prosecution." Karen's jaw dropped open, her eyes darting between Daniel, the officers, and the soldiers now spreading out to secure the perimeter. One soldier began taping off the construction site with yellow federal property, "Do not enter" tape. Another was documenting the scene, snapping photos of the demolished barn and dug-up soil. Karen clutched her clipboard tighter, as if the stack of HOA bylaws could somehow protect her from the law she'd tried to manipulate. "You can't do this," she shouted, her voice trembling now. "We followed every rule. We had county approval based on falsified jurisdictional boundaries." The officer replied calmly, "Your annexation was processed during the landowner's military deployment. That violates both state property law and federal protections for active duty service. This case is now under federal jurisdiction." Karen's clipboard slipped from her fingers, paper scattering into the dust. For the first time, she looked small, dwarfed by the trucks, the soldiers, and the truth. The neighborhood residents, who had once feared her, began to gather quietly at the edge of the street, whispering among themselves. Some held their phones up, recording, others simply watched, stunned. The woman who once controlled every mailbox color, every lawn length, every porch light, was now powerless. Daniel finally stepped forward. His boots crunched on the gravel as he approached her. His voice was calm but carried the weight of every battle he'd ever fought. "You built an empire on greed, Karen," he said evenly, his eyes fixed on hers. "You bullied veterans, seniors, and families because you thought paperwork made you powerful." He paused, glancing at the wreckage of his childhood home, the barn flattened, the oak tree marked for removal. "But you forgot one thing," he continued. "You can't bully someone who knows how to fight for what's his." Karen swallowed hard, her defiance flickering like a dying flame. Behind her, the HOA banner flapped weakly in the wind, a symbol of her fading control. The officers began loading boxes of seized documents into the trucks. Construction workers, realizing the job was over, quietly packed up their tools. As the convoy prepared to leave, Daniel turned one last time toward the land, his land, and exhaled deeply. The fences would come down soon. The tree could be saved. Justice, though slow, had finally arrived. Karen stood frozen in place, staring at the flag patch on Daniel's sleeve. For the first time, she didn't have a rule book to hide behind. The soldier she'd tried to crush had reminded her, and the entire town, that some things are more powerful than HOA bylaws. Honor, truth, and the will to stand your ground. And as the military trucks rolled away, the townspeople began to clap softly. One by one, a quiet salute to the man who fought one last battle. Not for a medal or recognition, but for home. Within just a few days, the facade of Maple Creek's perfect community began to crumble. The HOA's corruption, once buried under mountains of paperwork and intimidation, came roaring into the light. County inspectors poured through files retrieved from the seized HOA office, uncovering a tangled web of deceit, fake homeowner signatures on petitions, altered property deeds, and hundreds of unlawful fines issued under Karen Blake's authority. The so-called HOA queen had built her empire on manipulation and greed, and now, it was collapsing piece by piece. By the end of the week, Maple Creek was no longer a quiet neighborhood. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Reporters with microphones in hand scrambled for the best angles as federal agents escorted boxes of evidence into black SUVs. Headlines blared across local stations. HOA president, arrested in massive fraud scandal, and Maple Creek HOA, linked to fake deeds. Extortion scheme. The once pristine sign at the neighborhood's entrance was now wrapped in yellow tape, its proud letters, a Karen Blake community, half torn off by the wind. And at the center of it all stood Karen herself. Her hair, once perfectly styled, hung limp under the weight of stress and humiliation. Her crisp blazer was wrinkled, her defiance fading, as 2 county deputies led her down the steps of the HOA office in handcuffs. Flashes from cameras lit up the scene like lightning. She tried to hold her head high, but her voice trembled with venom when she spotted Daniel among the crowd. "You'll regret this, Sergeant," she hissed, her face twisting with rage. Daniel didn't move. He simply looked at her, calm, resolute, and free of the anger that had once consumed him. "I already did," he said quietly, his voice steady as stone. "That's why I'm ending it." Karen's glare faltered. For the first time, she had no power, no threats, no clipboard full of rules to hide behind. The law had finally caught up with her, and there was no HOA clause in existence that could save her now. In the weeks that followed, justice moved swiftly. The military's legal division completed its review, confirming Daniel's rightful ownership of the land. The property had been improperly annexed into the HOA while he was deployed overseas, a clear violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act. The ruling was unanimous. The land belonged to Sergeant Daniel Hines. Every illegal structure, fence, and no trespassing HOA property sign was torn down under federal supervision. Bulldozers flattened the remnants of Karen's unauthorized community center, and workers cleared away the debris until the land once again resembled the quiet homestead Daniel remembered from his youth. What shocked everyone was that the restoration came at no cost to him. The county and the Federal Veterans Trust jointly covered the expenses as part of the restitution for the years of harassment and property damage he had endured. When Daniel signed the final documents, officially reclaiming his land, he didn't smile in triumph. He simply exhaled, as though releasing years of buried pain. Months passed, and Maple Creek began to heal. The HOA was formally dissolved after a unanimous vote from the residents, many of whom came forward with their own stories of intimidation and unfair treatment. Without the threat of fines or petty rules hanging over them, the neighborhood transformed. Lawns that were once forced into rigid perfection began to bloom with individuality. Kids rode their bikes freely again, laughter echoing down the street without Karen's constant watch, and Daniel's land, once a battlefield of legal wars, became the heart of the community. He rebuilt his farmhouse from the ground up, stronger and more beautiful than before. The walls smelled of fresh pine, the porch wrapped wide enough for everyone to gather. On weekends, neighbors who had once lived in fear of HOA penalties now gathered on that porch for barbecues, storytelling nights, and small-town celebrations. There were no rules, no bylaws, just people, finally free to live as they wished. Daniel often stood back during these gatherings, quietly observing as children played tag near the old oak tree he'd fought to save. The same ground Karen had claimed for her expansion project was now a playground of laughter and life. It wasn't just his home that had been restored, it was the spirit of the community itself. One warm evening, as the sky burned orange with the setting sun, Daniel stepped out onto his porch. The hum of friendly conversation drifted through the air, mixed with the smell of grilled food and the distant strumming of a guitar. He looked toward the flagpole in his yard, where the American flag fluttered proudly in the breeze. The same flag that had stood by him through deployments, loss, and battles both abroad and at home. "This," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else, "is what I fought for." His words carried weight, not just as a soldier's reflection, but as a promise fulfilled. That freedom, justice, and home were worth defending, no matter the odds. And as night fell over Maple Creek, the stars glimmered above the peaceful neighborhood, a quiet reminder that even in the darkest fights, truth and courage will always find their way home.